Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ramayad, Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. Today is a special day for the Atlantic Council and its Africa Center. His Excellency, Mr. Vice President of the Republic of Nigeria, Professor Yemi Osinbanjo, is our special guest of honor. He will deliver opening keynote remarks. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We are all the more grateful as you just announced your decision to run for presidency of Nigeria. Since 2014, your country is the Africa's largest economy. And with over 200 million people, it is the largest market in the continent. A few years ago, incorporating the film and telecom industry into Nigeria's GDP made a huge difference, rendering the country's economy not just bigger, but more diversified. Oil remains the largest national income generator, though. For all these reasons, it is critical to hear your leading voice. The launch of our Inclusive African Climate Working Group is a wonderful occasion. We have been struck by the failure of the previous COP26 in Glasgow, and personally even upset by the way Africans have been ignored while Africa faces drought, floods, declining agricultural productivity, deforestation, difficult access to water, rising seas, advancing deserts. It's not fair because the continent is responsible for only 4% of global carbon emissions. Of the 7 countries in the world that emit 2/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions, none are African. More important, there's only one country in the world that respects the Paris agreements, and this country is African, Gambia. The next COP will take place on the African continent in Egypt next November. Important not to miss that meeting. Under the moderation today of our senior fellow Aubrey Ruby, the Atlantic Council's working group will work throughout the year to promote a stronger African message, to make African voices central in the next conversation around COP, to amplify thought leadership around an African vision on climate change issues, and particularly on climate finance and strategic sectors like gas. The Western community should understand that for Africans, the choice is not always between fossil and renewable energy, but between electricity and death, and consider gas as a transitional energy instead of defending it so promptly. That is why, you expressed this message so eloquently, Professor Osibanjo, in a recent paper on foreign policy, The Divestment Delusion. We are happy to welcome you today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ramayad. Thank you. And thank you all for inviting me to speak today. Every nation must play its part in solving the dual crisis of global poverty and climate change. Africa must be committed to solving both of these emergencies because both poverty and a warming planet affect us more than any other region. And we're absolutely clear that Africa must be proactive, we must be assertive of our needs, and we must do a better job of making our views heard. And this is what to expect in Egypt. And before I explain Nigeria's climate commitments and what we expect from our international partners, if I may start with 3 core facts. The first is that energy is a stark and inexcusable example of global inequality. And the pandemic has laid bare the realities of global inequality, that certain regions are hit the hardest and the global response is usually uneven and unjust. Today, less than 10% of Africans are fully vaccinated. Inequality is just as unforgivable when it comes to energy. So 48 sub-Saharan countries, our entire region minus South Africa, are home to more than 1 billion people. Yet we all use less electricity than Spain. And we should not accept a world where any person uses less electricity than an American refrigerator. My second point is around that curious term of a just transition. Climate policy accepts that a just transition is necessary to ensure that no communities get left behind. But the concept of justice narrowly applies to just easing the pain of coal communities in the US, in Germany, in India, or perhaps South Africa as they transition away from coal. But what is a just transition for countries with no coal and with deep energy poverty? So a just transition would mean something very different for every other African country, including my own country, Nigeria. For us, a just transition means a lot more energy, not less, and climate justice must include ending global energy poverty. Every person on the planet deserves to have modern energy. Every person deserves a job. All modern economies require abundant, affordable, and reliable energy. And with the impact of climate change bearing down on us, every nation must have enough energy to build resilient infrastructure, to deliver essential public services, and provide the cooling and air conditioning to withstand a warming planet. And I'll just repeat this, climate justice must include ending energy poverty. My third point, every country must find its own path to a low carbon future. The EU decision to label both gas and nuclear as green energy is a clear recognition that Europe knows that countries need a wide range of options. The United States, too, has a long-term plan that includes an array of different technologies that meet the needs of diverse communities across the country. So Africa, too, will find its own path. Africa will use an array of technologies that meet the needs of diverse countries across the continent. So what about Nigeria? Again, let's start with a few facts. By 2050, Nigeria will be the third largest country in the world, surpassing the United States in population. Will also be majority urban. In other words, Nigeria will top 30, Lagos, which is our commercial capital, will top 30 million people. That is 50% bigger than metropolitan New York today. So Nigeria must meet the energy and employment needs for both rural communities and very large populations concentrated in mega cities. So Nigeria will require huge investments in new infrastructure. We're going to build more roads, more ports, industrial parks, and especially power systems. For every Nigerian to consume the modern energy minimum of 1,000 kilowatt hours per year by 2050 would require a 15-fold increase in our national power generation today. To ensure that every household has access to cleaner cooking, it will require us to access LPG, that's liquefied petroleum gas, biogas, and electric cooking for the tens of millions of families still cooking with wood and charcoal. So what is Nigeria's energy transition plan? Our President Buhari, pledged at COP26 that Nigeria will reach net zero emissions by 2060. And this is also reflected in our energy transition plan. At the same time, our immediate priority is to create 20 million jobs and rebuild our industries. So we must add more than 200 gigawatts of new power capacity, principally utility-scale solar, by 2060. So we'll need to upgrade our power infrastructure, especially for transmission and distribution, using a strategic mix of grid and mini-grid systems. We must also reduce our reliance on inefficient and dirty diesel generators and end gas flaring by capturing that resource for productive uses. To be successful, we need partners. The majority of investment in our energy transition will come from our own national resources, but we estimate that we need an additional 410 billion US dollars above business as usual investment to meet our goals. So the 8.5 billion package pledged to South Africa to accelerate its transition off coal provides an important signal of global support for Africa's energy transition, but it can't just be about South Africa. Nigeria, with 5 times more people and far deeper energy poverty, will need a transition package of at least 10 billion US dollars per year for the next 2 decades to fund new generation, transmission infrastructure, smart grids, data management systems, and storage capacity to integrate new distributed renewable energy systems. Of course, we're not asking for charity, but we're asking for a partnership to mobilize private capital, to harness clean technology supply chains, and to transform our economy while protecting lives and livelihoods. Like other regions, Africa will need flexibility too. And this is so important. In the United States and in Europe, it's accepted that natural gas is a transition fuel and necessary to energy security. In rich nations, gas is still used for cooking, heating, and industry, and for balancing a power system, especially as more variable wind and solar are added to the grid. Yet it has somehow become fashionable to deny this same flexibility to Africa, to assume that we can leapfrog fossil fuels without working with us to understand our challenges and our needs is clearly unjust and will delay our development and our transition to a cleaner future. So I think, just to be clear, Nigeria, as I'm sure other African countries, will have a low carbon energy future. We're committed to the Paris Accord, and we will reach net zero by 2060. We aim to build a 21st century economy for our people using the latest technologies to create competitive jobs and lift our people into the middle classes. Our energy transition plan projects 70% of our electricity will come from solar. But to get there, we need natural gas over the next 2 decades to provide cleaner cooking, to power our industry, to generate electricity, and to balance large influxes of solar power. Fortunately, we have our own gas resources, which we need to use, not only for export earnings, but for our own development. This is why I, along with other African leaders, are concerned about new financing rules, making it difficult for developing countries to access finance for gas to power. Yes, we know that there are some exceptions, but we're already seeing the investment rules limit technology choices of African countries in ways that do not apply to wealthy nations. So applying a set of standards to Africa that will not be applied in the wealthier countries is the opposite of climate justice. If the global energy transition is going to become reality, if we're truly in this climate crisis together, if we're working together in this crisis, then the priorities of African nations cannot be sidelined. Climate justice must include far greater support for countries with the greatest needs and who contribute the least, as Ambassador Yard pointed out, to global emissions. It must include investments, not only to mitigate carbon emissions, but also to ensure that developing countries can adapt to the impact of climate change caused by the rich polluting nations. Climate justice must include ending energy poverty. Anything else will be the opposite of justice and a strategic failure for the world. I'm confident that we can get there at COP26. Egypt will be a crucial moment for African leaders to explain their common position and for Western leaders to show that they are hearing us and living up to their commitments and responsibilities. I think Egypt can be a turning point for fighting climate change and for ending global poverty. The win-win is there for the world to grasp. We can succeed, but only if the needs of developing countries are heard and taken seriously. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Really appreciate those remarks and articulating a very clear vision of what a just transition looks like for African markets. And I think you mentioned it somehow, but in your remarks, you said that we really need natural gas as a transition fuel. There have been many who have said that Africa should just leapfrog natural gas and not repeat the mistakes. In fact, there was an article written in response to your article in Foreign Affairs making this same point. How would you respond to those who say that?
I think there just isn't. I just don't think there's much merit to that, with all due respect. And the reason is that you cannot, given the realities of industrial power, for example, or requirements of industrial power, solar today does not provide the kind of base load that you need for industry. which is why the European countries and America are still using gas for industry, which is why they're not doing what they're asking us to do, because it just doesn't make sense. So I think the point really is that if today, I mean, we still haven't discovered a way of getting out of gas, especially, a cheaper way, a more effective way. And then when you have all this natural gas resource and you're not using it, and the rest of the world are using it, and they're saying, guys, you don't use yours, we will use ours, but please don't touch yours, and you just do something cleaner and better. It's not going to work. I mean, I just think that I haven't been able to understand the argument, quite frankly, that we can do away with gas and then use solar, especially for industry. And you see, for us in particular in Africa, there is a use now for cooking purposes of firewood and all sorts of dirty fuels. And the way to transition properly, of course, is to use gas, LPG, as the transition fuel, so that it is safer for people, healthier, and then of course it is cleaner. Obviously not as clean as solar power, but it's much better for cooking purposes today. So these are just fairly basic for us, and I think that it's important for the wealthier countries not to think that this is fair for them, but not that for others they should make the sacrifice. I think Africa is the least equipped to make the sacrifices that we're called to make. And obviously, just as Ambassador Yard pointed out, we're the least polluters. Why should we take the burden?
And do you think the war in Ukraine has changed views on this? Because before then, I think many European countries were saying, you could maybe do without so much natural gas, but then they realized that natural gas is very critical to the European energy mix. Do you think it's changed at all?
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it better, and you're absolutely right. And I think in some ways, the Ukraine war, unfortunate, as it is, and tragic as it is, in some ways has showed up that argument as being, completely without basis, because obviously the European countries have suddenly realized that, this gas is so useful and so inevitable. In fact, we have been approached, for gas, and I'm sure gas-rich countries have been approached for gas, to replace some of what is coming, what would have been coming from Russia. So I think that, clearly, no question in my mind at all that there's no way you can run away from gas now, and we shouldn't be asked to make those kinds of sacrifices.
Yes, and I want to turn to now one of our panelists, Teria Gabasian, a fellow Nigerian, to ask you one question. She is the CEO of ARM Harith and raising a climate fund currently. So Teria, your question for the Vice President.
Thank you, Aubrey, and Your Excellency. It's a pleasure to hear from you, and thank you for your leadership, especially on matters of the just transition for Nigeria. It's greatly appreciated. My question has to do with African agency in the climate discourse, especially as tied to the global community, and how African leaders can position, especially in advance of COP27. How do you recommend or view the role of the African leadership community, both private and public, as we go into COP27 to position for a greater level of voice, greater level of partnership across the African community as well as the global community as we tackle some of these really dicey issues that we've talked about, which is energy access, but managing the transition in ways that are very specific to different African countries, South Africa versus Nigeria, coal versus oil and gas dependency. How do you recommend that we position for COP27? And what do you see as the priorities for an African-led COP this year?
Okay, thanks. I think first is that we need to talk. we need to talk. I think African countries need to talk, and we need to talk around the specific requirements, the specific needs of Africans as we transition. So I think that the very first thing is to provide ourselves opportunities to hash out these problems and these issues so that we can come to some common agreements. And there are a few initiatives going on already. There will be a conference in Kigali where African ministers will be meeting. I think it's organized by C4All and all that. And several African countries have agreed to attend that. I think that will be an important meeting to basically hash out what the issues are and begin to focus our minds more on what this really means for Africa and what we want to get out of COP27. Thereafter, there's a follow-up meeting which the UNDP is also working with us to organize alongside Egypt. We hope that that will be a follow-up to Kigali so that we have more opportunities to talk. Because, I think part of the problem now is that we just haven't come together as African states, African leaders, including private sector and civil society, to say this is the African position, these are the issues. And I think the simplest way of putting this is to say that that Africa faces two crises, if you like. I mean, the first is poverty, extreme poverty, and how to get ourselves out of it, which of course includes questions around access to electricity, because that is really the way to go if we're going to get out of extreme poverty. The second also, and both as important as each other, is a whole question of, is a whole question of climate change itself and the implications of climate change for everything. So I think it's important that we point out and that the African leadership understands that it isn't just one problem. In our case, there are two existential issues. One is poverty, the other is climate change. And we need to deal with both, as it were, hand in hand. And we need to agree that both are as important as the other. As a matter of fact, the poverty issue obviously is much more crucial for us. So yes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And really, your remarks really set the stage for our discussion in this panel. So first, let us thank you for joining us today. We know you have a very busy schedule. Obviously, you're more than welcome to remain, but we are now going to switch to our panel. And I want to kick off by first turning to Salim Fakir, who's the Executive Director of the Africa Climate Foundation. And Salim, I would love to hear from you first of all, what the foundation does, and what do you think about what the Vice President said, and does it resonate with things you're hearing in South Africa and in East Africa and around the region?
Sure, thank you very much, Aubrey, and just to share my appreciation to have participate in this session with the Vice President of Nigeria. We as the ACF hope to work with Nigeria in the next coming year on exactly this question of the supporting Nigeria on the energy transition. So the African Climate Foundation is a philanthropic organization. We've been very active in South Africa on the just transition plan and process in South Africa, as there is very high dependency on coal, and both the majority of stakeholders in South Africa are very keen on not only solving the energy security problem, but also recognizing that certain technologies, particularly clean energy technologies, are becoming more cost effective and competitive. And we ought to diversify our energy mix to make it, the energy system, more resilient and responsive to different needs as the world moves towards more decarbonized approach. We're hoping to take the model of how we've done the energy transition work in South Africa, in other parts of the continent. We share the same sentiment as the Vice President has echoed, that we need to focus on trying to combine climate finance and the climate agenda with the broader economic and development agenda, not only of particular national states on the continent, but in general the African economy. We have to straddle diverse interests. I've mentioned one of them. In this case, energy security and resilience. The second part is around our ability to lower our dependency on fossil fuels. It's crucial that countries are able to do that in a strategic way. We know of Algeria, for example, which is highly dependent on the use of gas for electrification, is now looking to expand renewables largely to lower consumption of gas and to actually generate increased revenues from its gas. It's a diminishing resource over time. We have to be able to link the energy security and with our economic growth, industrialization, and all these other dimensions which you wouldn't find in more advanced economies are more pertinent. So this is what we're looking to push, and we hope that our agenda is really to expand the space for clean energy on the continent.
Yeah,
from
thank
an
you.
investment point of view. Investment.
Yeah, Salim, just echoing that tension that we heard the Vice President
That's
speaking
right.
about. And Alphonse, would like to come to you. You're the Executive Director of the Africa Group 2 at the World Bank. Obviously, the World Bank has climate finance very top of mind and as a priority. What are you specifically seeing in the space, and did the Vice President's words kind of resonate with you?
Yes, it did. But first, thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm honored to have joined the session with the Vice President of Nigeria. I think we all have a common goals and fighting for the same. We have the same fight, to say the least. From the bank side, as you may know, so we have a new policy that that was published in 2021, and the policy is attempting to align development and climate, so which can be tricky at times because we have board members come from different constituencies, which are not always aligned when it comes to the way we look at climate and development. For African countries, we want to prioritize development. They want to prioritize climate. So this is where we maybe get into some conflict. But as far as the policy is concerned, so there's some key priorities that is of interest for African countries. So the transition, energy transition is one. Agriculture, food, water, and cities is the other one. Transport and manufacturing is the other one. So we know that the energy has to be part of the equation if we had to grow our economies. So we internally here as an executive director and representing 23 African countries, my fight has been to make sure while we pursue the climate agenda, we don't forget that access to energy is very, very important. It's the only way we can promote economic growth and create jobs for young people that are coming online. There's a lot of unemployment in Francophone Africa. Most of my countries are Francophone. We do want to build climate resilient and have benefited from the pollution from the big countries, but we don't want to continue to be paying for it. We want to make sure we focus on the economic development first before we focus on to build climate resilient. But we also want to make sure that the policies that are developed around climate differentiate African countries um, from other regions, especially the developed world. We want to make sure that those policy address first what we need. We need access. We need electricity that is affordable. We need the electricity that is reliable and sustainable. And the vice president mentioned, I think you can have electricity for household just for lights, but you need electricity, you need a base load that is you can constantly access. And we want to draw the private sector in. I, in particular, spent most of my career in the private sector side as an investor. in the energy sector. And I find the experience in Latin America is very relevant for Africa, because we need to have the private sector involved in, at least on the production of electricity. To do that, we need to be able to attract them, which means our governments have to focus on making the electricity companies that are state-owned solvent. If they're not solvent, they cannot sign power purchase agreement. If we don't have electricity sufficient enough for the industries, what happens? If you recently, I just came back from Capo Verde. So all the international organizations, institutions, private sector companies large enough, they wind up setting up generators. Those generators use diesel
Yeah.
so which is more polluting than using the alternative that we would like to be able to use, which is gas. While the developed countries are telling us that we should not be using gas because it pollutes. But I know from the research that we've had that the U.S. is still planning to build gas plant. And
Yeah, absolutely. It's
yeah,
exactly that tension we were bringing up with the vice president, that the Europeans and Americans recognize the need for gas as base fuel, but don't necessarily want Africans, or don't believe that it should still be part of the mix. And I
yeah,
think you bring up a very good other point, which is that the status quo today can be very dirty. So, for example, people using charcoal to cook, that is causing deforestation. And that, so leaving the status quo is not good either, because
yeah,
it by nature is dirtier. And I'm glad you brought up the point on hearing from the private sector and investors, because I would like to come to Akim Dauda, who is the CEO of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Gabon, to hear about how, as an investor, you're thinking about doing and investing in climate projects. So Akim, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you. I'm really happy to be with all you guys this afternoon. I mean, afternoon here in Gabon, and special note to His Excellency, Mr. the Vice President. Let me just give you some element of context, some facts, so that you first understand where Gabon is positioned in this climate conversation. Gabon is a country in Central Africa, in the Congo Basin. And actually, we're one of the highest high forest, low deforestation country. 87% of the territory is covered by forest. And we one of, if not the most absorber country in terms of CO2. Basically, we absorb 140 million tons of CO2 every year, and we emit around 40 million. So we net absorber of 100 million plus of carbon every year, which is carbon capture. And given that, now coming back to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, just to give you also some element, we really have a simple mandate, which is to create shared prosperity in the country through building basic infrastructure, promoting entrepreneurship, and doing urban development, while preserving the environment, while doing all that, because we do believe in the bond that we don't have to choose between social, economical development for our population or preserving the environment. This is something that can be aligned, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, as an investor in Gabon, we have more than 75% of our portfolio invested in infrastructure, of which 60% is invested in renewable energy, mainly hydro dams. We're building hydro dams, and it was just mentioned a bit earlier by my fellow panelists. It was really critical for us to initiate that, or to catalyze that. We really had to get the private sector involved. When you look back in 2013, 100% of the infrastructure of Gabon were built on the national budget. We could at the time, because our price was at a certain level. But then we had 2013, 2014, we had drop in our prices, and it was really critical to find new ways to build those critical infrastructure, especially that Gabon is a country that was embarked in a trip to move from a country that was exporting raw material to to a country that wanted to export processed goods. And for that, we needed energy to transform our timber, to transform our mines and capture a larger portion of the value added locally and create jobs for our youth. So we were both using the Sovereign Wealth Fund as the anchor investor, having skin in the game. We were both to stimulate additional investment by international investment fund. And that's how today we're currently developing a pipeline of $1.2 billion of infrastructure, and it was 5 projects in total, and 3 of them are already, 2 of them already closed, and 3 of them are going to financial close by the end of this year. So,
and how do you think of green infrastructure going forward? Because it seems to me that there's energy projects, which obviously like hydro can be clean energy, but then, if you're building a road or you're building a bridge, or let's say your industrial park in Gabon, how do you think of green, especially urban infrastructure? I mean, the vice president talked about Lagos becoming a city of 30 million. How do you build kind of this future green infrastructure? Are you doing a lot of thinking on that, Akim?
We're doing a lot of thinking, but again, that's why I started by giving you the context of Gabon. We're already a carbon sink. So if we want to look at it just as a standalone, if we look at it, although we know that this is an issue that concerns the whole world, and we all have to make this plane land. So, but that's that part. In terms of the pressure of looking at the environmental impact of those infrastructure, but like it was also mentioned earlier, we have to balance. The negative impact of the status quo on the environment, and what could be the impact of building that infrastructure. And obviously, we will put in place all the mitigants possible to make sure that environmentally we do less harm to the environment than the benefit we're bringing to our population. Because even for hydro, like I said, 87% of the territory is rainforest. So obviously, some of our sites are in middle of national parks, for instance. So those are the critical discussions that we need to have, because you have to look at how you preserve the biodiversity, how you make sure that certain species are still replicated in other places of the country. But quickly, because I know in the interest of time, I'm not sure that I have the opportunity to talk again. So there's one point that I also wanted to raise, because we've been talking a lot about energy justice, right? Energy poverty and energy injustice, so to say, especially in Africa. There's another injustice that we're not hearing a lot, but which is there, is the injustice for countries such as Gabon, whereby the market today, I mentioned to you that we capture more than 1 million tons of carbon every year. And this is through science. We have the science, we have the data, right? But today, the market does not value those carbon. There's no market for carbon capture. There's a market for reforestation, but not for carbon capture, because what we hear is we won't pay you to let the forest do what the forest does. But the reality is, if the forest is still there, it was a deliberate choice by our forefathers, right? And so if we don't have an incentive to preserve the forest, it can really become a critical issue. We've seen countries that were net absorber, like the largest carbon sink, the Amazon, which is today a net emitter, right? Yeah. So I would just finish by saying that if we don't find an economical path for countries such as Gabon or for the Congo Basin to make sure that we can sustainably preserve the rainforest, that rainforest that today is providing services to the Blue Nile, which is providing rain to the Blue Nile, which is then allowing agriculture in Egypt. You might have 100 million of Egyptians as refugees to Europe tomorrow. So that's another problem that maybe today people are not hearing enough, right?
Yeah, thank you, Akim. Thank you, Akim, for really mentioning the kind of new frontiers of carbon markets in terms of the carbon sink, because we always hear about the Congo Basin and its potential and how it's become the biggest carbon sink, but it surpassing the Amazon, but who knows how long that will last. Before I go to Terry, Salim, I saw you nodding your head about the need for carbon markets and carbon sequestration in Africa. So like to see if you wanted to respond to what.
No, I was going to ask Taria to talk about this because she sits on she's a vice co-chair of a big voluntary market process. So maybe Taria, you want to add to this?
Yeah, Terry, you've not only do that, but you've also written a lot about green infrastructure. So maybe you can speak to both topics.
Sure, happy to do that. I was actually going to follow up with Akeem that we need to have a bilateral on this because I have been doing a lot of I have been doing a lot of work with the in the carbon markets world as the co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, and that organization is focused on two things. One is really around the integrity of claims as organizations make net zero commitments and use the voluntary carbon markets and credits to meet their obligations. And so it's really putting guardrails toward net zero objectives. But the carbon sinks are so fundamental to that. And the reforestation and sequestration, preservation and capture are very critical to that process. And one of the things I think you'd be happy to hear is that we actually have a country group where we're focused on actually helping countries with access strategies. And I'd be very happy to bring Gabon into that conversation. That's one of the areas that I'm personally very interested in, is ensuring that Africa doesn't get left behind in terms of monetizing, valuing this carbon, because we're indeed making a significant contribution to the world carbon budget, if you will, in terms of providing these carbon sinks. So like I said, I'd be very happy to catch up on that. But just to sort of make a connection and sort of to connect the Gabon experience with the Nigerian experience that you touched upon. One of the challenges that we have in Nigeria is this massive population and the fact that we are only going to continue to grow and only continue to urbanize and industrialize to at least build a certain level of wages and a consumption system for these people. What we find is that in Nigeria, a lot of our emissions are actually tied to fugitive emissions and deforestation. And deforestation is tied to agriculture and and basically cooking resources. So a lot of what drives our current mitigations are not actually so much tied to consumption as it is to these other factors. But the issue of the low carbon future is about how we grow and what is the pathway for growth, how we actually build in low carbon infrastructure that meets a 30 to 50 year pathway, and to do that efficiently. And so it's very important as we move into investing in infrastructure, and this is one of the things that our fund is looking at, is how to build low carbon infrastructure from an African perspective, solving for African issues related to making low carbon energy and using it as the best source of energy. How do we actually optimize making energy more affordable, more accessible, but to put us on a green pathway? But the challenge we have in Africa is that there does seem to be a disconnect with the perception of what is clean versus not. If you look at Nigeria, where deforestation is one of the greatest contributors to our carbon footprint, if you will, one of the solutions, as His Excellency said, is LPG. But LPG is typically emitting. And so what we also need is a lot more data. And we need a lot more investment as African countries in the data to be able to use science to prove why some pathways are cleaner, what those projections will be. And it ties to the global priorities around shifting from making sort of generalized commitments, and we deal with this in the VCMI, which is really moving towards science-based targets, ensuring that we really have the data to back up what we're doing. And I'm pretty convinced that if as African leaders, both public and private, we focus on building science-based targets, science-based analytics, we might actually show that, and in fact, it is showing that some of the pathways are going to involve transitions. It's only going to become clearer. And so I think we're hoping that we'll see more of that to be able to guide us in our investment decisions toward lower carbon infrastructure.
No, thanks for that, Terry. And I think you spoke, and I want to come back to Alphonse. you spoke about different associations and different groupings, and what we're seeing is this emerging climate finance architecture, right? And in some ways, you could just spend all your time in meetings and in groups and in working groups, and we even announced our own working group. How can we shape this architecture to make it work for Africa? And how can that architecture feed into success at COP? So Alphonse, I want to come back to you because you're obviously working and sitting every day in one of the key nodes or key players in this architecture, and to give some response to what you've heard today and thinking about shaping the architecture so that it better works for African countries.
Thank you for coming back. So the one thing I wanted to add, which is goes toward the markets, we are also thinking of the electricity market in Africa as if every country should have a same level of access of power plants and production for their needs. We're finding, and recently I was in Ivory Coast and Niger, and in the Sahel country, they can buy electricity much cheaper from Cote d'Ivoire than they can produce. So why not make the electricity market much more efficient and fluid? In Latin America, you can do that. Or in Africa, we don't have an electricity market that runs as well. So I think we need to also look at the strategy on the investment side to make sure we invest in where we get the most out of the investment, and that a country like Cote d'Ivoire can provide electricity to other countries cheaper than they can produce for themselves. I think it's important to make sure that we also focus on creating the market in the electricity market in Africa.
Yeah, and then these broader carbon markets that speak to the architecture. Salim, I want to come back to you.
No, I wanted to pick up the point from Alfonso. I think, there's been a lot of talk about gas, but there are lots of countries on the continent that don't have the luxury of either having gas reserves, but they have to find ways of generating electricity through other means. So they have two options. If you look at East Africa, you can exploit the base load of hydropower. You can build around it a good integrated grid capacity. You can, in fact, effectively, if you combine hydropower, Uganda, Ethiopia, and other countries, you can effectively create a 90% decarbonized grid in East Africa, and you can build around it variable sources of power like renewables and so on. So we have to look at this as more strategic options. There's no need to just focus on individual countries having to find the resources and the finances to build power. As Alfonso says, some countries have better resource capacity and they can generate electricity at much cheaper prices. We have to build better power pool systems that can create a more liberalized or effective market in which sources of electricity can be more affordable. There is no necessarily a correlation between three things: having a source for generation, the ability to transmit that source on a wider scale, and thirdly, that the source itself will be cheaper for the end user at the end of the production of that generation. These are three challenges in Africa that we have to solve. They, irrespective of what the technology is, whether it's gas, coal, or renewables, these are fundamental structural and institutional issues that, for me, are the basic ingredients of actually building the diverse and flexible energy sources that will be good investments and the basis for developing the economies across the continent.
Akeem, I saw you nodding your head. I feel like you have some agreement there, and maybe you can give some sense of how you're thinking about the future and COP and how Gabon will go about COP this coming year in Cairo.
Perfect, sure. But let me just echo Salim and Alphonse quickly on the need for integration and pooling, having energy pool. For instance, we're going to take the case of Gabon. We have today the estimated need for the next 10 years in terms of energy is between 1,500 megawatt. Meanwhile, we have a potential of 10,000 megawatt. So there's even some projects for which we're looking for financing. And then when we talk with banks, they're like, you don't even have the demand. So there's no way to finance such project because you don't have the demand. But you also have neighboring countries that have that need. So if we integrate our economies, if we build those transmission lines, then we can unlock those potential that is there, that potential of renewable clean energy. Talking about, that was just me echoing my co-panelist, but regarding COP, and I hope not just to paraphrase or repeat what has been said before, but here we really have to make sure that we have this conversation among ourselves, that we make sure that our voice is heard, but also that we speak from the same voice. And what the third point that is really critical, it's so far what I've seen, and maybe that's from my vantage point, conversation at COP, especially on the African side, have been led by the public sector mainly. With very, very little involvement by the private sector. And it's important that that change. It's important that we go there hand to hand and that we speak from the same voice.
Yeah, and just to follow in, one of our questions from the audience is, what would you like to see Europeans, what would your advice to European, like, let's think about institutional capital. There are trillions in the US and Europe in insurance companies, in pension funds, et cetera. And they're beginning to align their investment strategies with green and climate friendly investing. What would you say to them if you were presenting at an institutional investors conference? What message would you want them to hear about what does climate finance look like in Africa? So Akeem, I'll go by you and we'll do a quick round of all the panelists and then I'll close out the event.
Okay, first of all, we'll go back to the context that has been mentioned before. We the less contributor to the situation, but we the one who are suffering the most. So they definitely have to be part of the solution. That's one. Second, that's on our part in the sense that a lot of pledges have been made and very little has been delivered. But that's also because if we don't have a real actionable pipeline of projects, those resources will never be channeled to the continent. But for that, we need to have a clear view of what will be the cost of mitigation, adaptation, and energy transition. And that's the first step of it. Even before going into small nitty project here and there, what is the global need in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and energy transition? And obviously, there's no unjust sustainable solution. It doesn't go together. So if we're looking for a sustainable solution, it has to be fair and just.
No, I think that's critical within the framing, but I can see a reality when I log into my 401k, my retirement account. I'm going to log in and TD Ameritrade, it's going to say something like, do you want your retirement invested in fossil fuels? Yes or no? What if I click no? I do not. Then there's all kinds of ramifications for African DFIs as they try to raise money on the global capital markets, as Gabon tries to find, Sovereign Wealth Fund tries to find partners. Like, we need to think about what is a climate investment in that definition, because there could be a situation where African countries miss out on billions and billions of investment because they sit in environments that have to make difficult choices. And so, Salim, I want to turn to you. What would be your advice to European or American?
I think that there's huge opportunity in Africa. There's been, in the climate meetings, particularly these COP meetings, there's too much of a focus on adaptation. There isn't sufficient focus on energy infrastructure. In fact, we are of the view that building strong energy infrastructure unlocks other economic potential. And that in itself allows for more resources to be allocated towards resilience and adaptation in general, in many different dimensions. I don't need to go into the detail of that. But fundamentally, the architecture of finance itself has to be changed. No pots of money of 100 billion is going to be sufficient for the level of transition. So we shouldn't only rely on international finance. We have to actually mobilize domestic resources that are denominated in our own currency and not often in foreign currency. So we have a lot of work to do in Africa, and we actually have to find a large bulk of those resources from internally rather than just externally. But we got to change the global architecture as well, that it enables transitions that are pragmatic into the future.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, we see African DFIs stepping up to fill the gap, but that just means their portfolios will have more natural gas projects, for example, and they have to raise money on the international markets. They issue bonds, they get money from other governments, global governments. So these challenges are all very integrated. Terry, I would like to come to you and how you would recommend global capital pools think about green investing in Africa.
Thanks, Aubrey. I would just turn that slightly in terms of how regulators regulate global capital pools, because there's been so much progress in terms of the SEC regulations for disclosures, EU taxonomy and the like, but there hasn't been a tie-in as to how do you move beyond green bonds, because there is a framework for green investing, for a green bond that may address mitigation. But what we need is a broadening of that to make it more relevant for these flows to go to Africa. So is there an adaptation bond framework, a resilience bond framework, but more crucially, a transition bond framework? Because as we try to shift African economies and global South economies off oil and gas and coal and all sorts of more energy consumption type sectors, we need to be able to move capital into those regions, to develop new supply chains, to strengthen the supply chains for the green future. And the architecture does not support that right now. It doesn't support moving across the entire chain for climate, and it does not support global capital going to Africa and rewarding Africa for their unique proposition to solve for a green future.
No, thank you, Terry. I love the idea of the transition bond, and I hope you write more on that and we can get that. Alphonse, over to you, and then we'll turn to Rama.
I have written that down because
you have lots of co-collaborators here, Terry.
Just remember where it came from.
my colleagues from IFC. So no, and just a side note on Gabon. So I had a meeting with the energy minister not that long ago, and IFC is looking for a couple of investment to make there, which is good news in hydro and other types of fuel resource for the power plant. But as to your question, I think we also, as much as we talk about power pools and creating the markets and so on, I think we also have to stop looking at Africa as one country, because it's not. And we have different resources that are available that we can use to produce power. Some places have really good wind resource, so wind power is the option for them. Solar is viable in some places. And then we still have to be able to market gas as an alternative, which is cleaner than some of the things that we're currently using for electricity and for cooking. So, but the main selling point has to be that we need to we need electricity to catalyze industrial development, and we want to replace the dirtier fuel sources that we use in some of the countries at this point. So.
Yeah, and to recognize that the status quo is not tenable either, right? People cutting down trees to cook is not tenable. So the status quo, you can't just say no gas, just stay the same, because that's a dirty outcome as well. Really, it's been a robust conversation. I think there's some excellent collaboration starting here, and we couldn't be happier that the Vice President kicked us off. Now I want to turn to Ambassador Ramayad. She will close us out and say a few words about our working group and our effort in this space. Over to you, Rama.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. Can you hear me?
Yes, but your camera's not on.
Okay. I think someone in the AV teams needs to give me access. Okay, fine. I think that's fine now. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for this very, very exciting conversation. I think we could not have a better launch for our working group. I just would like to take the opportunity of these final remarks to ask to answer questions from our chat. What is this working group about? The answer is very simple. It is a group of people, 8, 10 African and global companies, funds, and or development organizations that have relevance to climate finance and green growth. Members are expected during the coming year to openly share ideas, learnings, and expertise. We have here 4 goals. The first is to building a consensus among working group members on the challenges and opportunities in climate finance and on African markets, to establish clear priorities in global climate finance, such as the need to fund natural gas as transitional energy, like I said at the opening. 3, we would like to engage with policymakers and influencers in the development finance institutions, communities, and to develop, as they develop climate finance standards and targets. And 4, we would like to create a platform of advocacy through thought leadership in the form of publications, media interviews, high profile public events that spotlight African successes in mitigating and adapting to climate change. So specifically, this working group would produce content series, of course, major research reports on climate finance and green growth, like I said, featuring specific recommendations on these sectors for the climate players, private briefings, exclusive events, and of course, at the end of the process in Egypt during the next COP27, we'd be happy to present our work through a pavilion in Egypt. It will be the best way to this time to hear African voices and maybe avoid the blah blah blah. So thank you everybody for this exciting conversation. I think our attendees enjoyed this interesting discussion. See you later and stay tuned. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.